Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something pretty huge, a really significant but often misunderstood chapter in European history, the Slavic migrations.
It really is fascinating. For centuries, how the Slavs spread across so much of Europe was this massive historical puzzle.
Right, exactly. I mean, how did such a vast cultural and linguistic shift happen, seemingly leaving so few, clear historical footprints of its own? It's been a real head-scratcher.
That's the mystery we're diving into. And the exciting part is some groundbreaking new genetic studies are finally giving us real answers. They're shedding light on the origins, the sheer scale, and the nature of these movements.
So we're getting a clearer picture now.
A much clearer picture. We're basically going to transform our understanding of this critical period. We're drawing mainly on two really key studies, one in Nature and another sort of an independent confirmation in genome biology.
Okay, great. So let's start with the puzzle itself. Why was the story of the Slavs so tricky to piece together historically?
Well, we knew they popped up in written records maybe around the 6th century CE.
Yeah, settling lands from the Baltic down to the Balkans, East Germany, across to Russia. A huge area.
A vast area. But their story felt really different from, say, the Goths or the Huns, whose movements and conquests were much more documented,
So what made the Slavs so elusive?
It mostly comes down to what they left behind, or maybe what they didn't leave behind.
Right.
Early Slavic communities, they mainly practiced cremation. That makes finding identifiable remains for things like DNA analysis incredibly hard.
Right, cremation destroys DNA.
Exactly. Plus, their houses were generally quite simple, their pottery often plain, undecorated, and crucially, they didn't leave their own written records for several centuries.
So very little for archaeologists or historians to grab onto, especially in those really early formative centuries.
Precisely. And that lack of evidence, especially the cremation issue, made genetic studies almost impossible for a very long time.
And you mentioned the term Slavs itself became a bit loaded.
Yeah, that's another layer. The name itself was often given to them by outsiders, by chroniclers in Byzantium or the Frankish kingdoms.
So not necessarily what they called themselves initially.
Possibly not, or at least not universally. And unfortunately, that label Slavs got tangled up later in nationalist ideas and ideological debates, which muddied the waters even more.
I can see that.
So this ambiguity fueled this huge, long-running debate. Was the spread of Slavic languages and culture mostly about large groups of people actually moving a mass migration?
Or was it more like local populations gradually adopting Slavic culture and language, a sort of Slavicization?
Exactly, or some mix of both. Historians argued back and forth for decades because the evidence, particularly for those early centuries, was just so thin.
Okay, so decades of debate.
Yeah.
And now, enter the ancient DNA. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Like a time machine for genetics.
That's a great way to put it. An international team, the Historians Consortium, pulled off the first really comprehensive ancient DNA study of these medieval populations.
Wow, and comprehensive means.
They sequenced over 550 ancient genomes. It's a huge data set. And their findings, published in Nature, have just fundamentally rewritten this whole chapter.
Okay, so what's the headline? What did this genetic time machine reveal?
The core finding is really unambiguous. The rise of the Slavs, at its heart, was a story of people moving massively.
So migration wins the debate.
It looks that way, yes. The genetic signatures point pretty clearly to an origin, a homeland, somewhere in the region from, say, southern Belarus down into central Ukraine.
Which lines up with what some archaeologists and linguists had suspected, right?
It does, yeah. It provides strong biological backing for those theories. As Joscha Gretzinger, one of the lead authors, said, while direct evidence from the absolute earliest core regions is still a bit scarce, their genetic results give the first real clues pointing to that origin area, somewhere between the Dniester and Don rivers.
Okay, so starting around the 6th century, we see a major movement of people carrying this specific Eastern European ancestry outwards.
Exactly. A large-scale movement spreading across Central and Eastern Europe.
And in some places, the impact was enormous.
Absolutely. In areas like what's now Eastern Germany and Poland, the genetic makeup of the population shifted almost entirely. It's a dramatic change.
But it wasn't like a Roman conquest with legions and imposed rule?
No, not that model. It seems they built their new societies more around flexible communities, often based on extended families, with strong patrilineal kinship ties tracing descent through the male line.
Interesting. And what about who was moving? Was it just warriors or?
That's another key finding. The genetic record shows no significant sex bias. Whole families were moving together, men, women, children. Both sexes contributed equally to building these new societies.
So entire communities relocating.
Seems like it. Zuzana Hoffmanova, another senior author, put it nicely. She said it wasn't like one single people moving monolithically. It was more like a mosaic of different groups, each adapting, blending in their own way. There probably wasn't just one single Slavic identity back then, but many.
That makes sense. A more fluid, adaptable kind of expansion.
Right. And it really underscores the scale of it. Johannes Krauss called it likely the last demographic event of continental scale to permanently and fundamentally reshape both the genetic and linguistic landscape of Europe.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. The last major reshaping of Europe's genetic map on that scale.
It really highlights the significance.
Okay, so you mentioned it was a mosaic, not uniform. Let's zoom in a bit. How did this play out differently in different regions? Maybe start with Eastern Germany. You said the shift there was dramatic.
Extremely dramatic. After the local Thuringian kingdom decline, the genetics show that over 85% of the ancestry in that region became linked to these new arrivals from the east.
85%. That's almost a complete population replacement.
It is, and it's a huge contrast to what was there just before during the earlier migration period.
What was it like before?
Well, take a site like Brücken, a late antique cemetery. The DNA showed a really cosmopolitan mix, people with ancestry from northern, central, southern Europe, all mingling.
And then the Slavs arrive.
And that diversity largely vanishes, replaced by this genetic profile very similar to modern Slavic-speaking groups in Eastern Europe today, like Poles or Ukrainians.
And the archaeology backs this up. You mentioned cemeteries.
Yes, the cemetery evidence from this period in Eastern Germany shows these new communities were often organized around large extended families, tracing lineage patrilineally. And we see a pattern where women, once they reached marriageable age, typically moved away from their birth village to join their husband's household.
Patrilocal residence, basically.
Exactly. And what's really striking for you, the listener, is that you can still see the echoes today.
How so?
The genetic legacy of those early Eastern European settlers is still clearly visible in the Sorbs, who are a Slavic-speaking minority group living in Eastern Germany right now. Their genetic profile is very closely related to those early medieval Slavic populations from over 1,000 years ago.
Incredible continuity. Okay, what about Poland? Any surprises there?
Poland's interesting because the genetics actually overturn some older ideas. There was a theory of long-term population continuity in Poland, that modern Poles were largely descended from people who'd been there for a very long time.
But the DNA says otherwise.
It does. Starting in the 6th and 7th centuries, the DNA shows the previous inhabitants who had strong genetic links to Northern Europe, even Scandinavia, almost completely disappear from the records.
Disappeared, replaced.
Successively replaced, yeah. By newcomers from the East whose genetic profiles are very close to modern Poles, Ukrainians, and Belarusians.
And is there direct evidence for these newcomers?
Yes, analysis of some of the earliest known Slavic inhumation graves in Poland, burial graves, not cremation, at a site called Grodek, provided really strong, direct evidence of these early migrants. It seals the deal, really.
So some minor mixing with locals, maybe, but overwhelmingly a population replacement that fundamentally shaped the genetics and language of the region.
That's the picture, yes. A very clear signal of large-scale population change.
Okay, so Eastern Germany and Poland show almost total replacement. What about further south? Let's say the northern Balkans, like Croatia. Was it the same story there?
Croatia and the Balkans show a different pattern, more complexity. It's a story of both change and continuity.
So not a complete genetic takeover.
No. Ancient DNA definitely shows a significant influx of that Eastern European-related ancestry, but it didn't completely replace the existing gene pool.
What happened instead?
Instead, the incoming Eastern European migrants mixed with the diverse local populations who were already there. They formed new hybrid communities.
A real melting pot, then.
Very much so. Genetic analysis of present-day Balkan populations shows that this incoming Eastern European ancestry varies quite a bit, but often makes up maybe half or even less of the total modern gene pool. It really highlights how complex the region's demographic history is.
Is there a specific site that shows this mixing clearly?
Yes, the site of Velum in Croatia is a great example. Some of the oldest Slavic burials found there show individuals with clear Eastern European ancestry buried alongside, and sometimes clearly related to, individuals with substantial local Balkan ancestry, up to 30% in some cases.
So direct evidence of blending from the very beginning.
Exactly. In the Balkans, the Slavic migration seems less like a wave of conquest and replacement, and more like a long process of intermarriage, cultural exchange, and adaptation. This created the linguistic and genetic diversity we still see in the Balkan Peninsula today.
Fascinating how different the regional stories are. Now, you mentioned a second study in genome biology that looked at Moravia in modern Czechia. Did that confirm these broader patterns?
It did, yes. It acts as a really valuable independent confirmation. This study, which actually involved some of the same senior researchers as the Hisgenes one, also found a strong genetic shift in southern Moravia between the 5th and 7th centuries.
A shift inconsistent with just local continuity.
Right. It pointed strongly towards a demographic change linked directly to the arrival of Slavic-associated material culture, specifically the Prague-Korčak culture, which, again, points back towards an origin in modern-day Ukraine.
And what were the people like before this shift in Moravia?
Interestingly, just like in eastern Germany, the earlier migration period samples from Moravia were incredibly diverse genetically. You had people with affinities stretching from the western Mediterranean all the way to Scandinavia, a real crossroads.
Similar to the Germanic settlements elsewhere.
Exactly. But then the early medieval samples, the ones associated with the Slavic Prague-Korčak culture, they form a much tighter, coherent genetic cluster, looking very similar to modern Poles and Lithuanians.
A clear change. Does this study have any unique finds?
One really key thing was the inclusion of an infant burial known as PJP00 Day. It was found in a very early Slavic context, a context usually associated only with cremation burial.
Ah, so an inhumation where they expected cremation.
Rare evidence. Extremely rare direct evidence from that very early phase. And its genetic signal was consistent with the later Slavic-associated samples from the 7th century onwards, right through the 9th and 10th centuries when Moravia became a major principality, the time of St. Cyril and Methodius, and the first written Slavic language.
Wow. Any other intriguing details from Moravia?
One little twist, some of the later Moravian samples from around the 9th century or so showed a small but noticeable component of East Asian ancestry.
East Asian, where would that come from?
Ranging from about 1.5% to nearly 5%, the thinking is it might suggest some interaction with Ivar groups who were known to have East Asian connections and were powerful in the region around that time.
But not the earliest Slavic samples there.
No, interestingly, it wasn't present in the earliest Slavic-associated individuals in Moravia, so it seems to be a later admixture event.
Okay, so we've got this massive movement of people replacing populations in some areas, mixing in others. But you said it wasn't just about movement. It was about a different way of life, a different social structure. How did that contribute to their success?
That's a crucial part of the story. It wasn't just demographics. It was sociology, maybe even ideology.
How so?
Medievalist Walter Pohl, who is also a senior author on the Nature paper, really framed it well. He described the Slavic migration as representing a fundamentally different model of social organization.
Different from what? From the Roman Empire or the Germanic kingdoms?
Exactly. Pohl called it a dynamic diffusion or grassroots movement. Think small groups, temporary alliances, settling new lands, often without imposing a rigid top-down identity or complex elite structures like the empires had.
So more flexible, less hierarchical.
Precisely. Their success might have come partly from this pragmatic, maybe more egalitarian lifestyle. It deliberately avoided the heavy taxes, the bureaucracy, the military burdens of the crumbling Roman world and some of its successors.
They offered a kind of credible alternative then.
I think that's a good way to put it. In many destabilized regions, the Slavic way of life, socially resilient, focused on a relatively simple subsistence economy, adaptable to things like climate shifts or even plagues like the Justinianic plague. It made them incredibly well-suited to thrive during periods of upheaval.
And the genetics, particularly from those East German cemeteries, gives us a window into how this actually worked at the family level, right?
An incredibly detailed window. Remember how we said the earlier pre-Slavic cemeteries showed smaller family units?
Yeah, fewer close relatives buried together.
Right. Typically fewer than 4 first- or second-degree relatives per site in the migration period. Those earlier communities, interestingly, were genetically diverse overall, but culturally quite uniform, and even showed signs of Southern European women integrating into society.
Okay, and then the Slavic period cemeteries.
A dramatic contrast. The number of close relatives buried together jumps nearly 6-fold.
6 times more close kin in one place.
Yes. They even found one amazing case, 7 offspring from the same couple buried at the same site, with several of those children living long enough to have their own children buried there too. It points to much larger, stable, multi-generational family groups forming the core of the community.
Wow. And did they find anything about marriage patterns or offspring?
A couple of fascinating details. First, looking at couples where they could identify both parents buried on site, there was a statistically significant bias towards sons. Among the buried offspring, 52 sons to 32 daughters.
Huh. Any idea why? Maybe differential burial practices.
It's hard to say for sure. Could be burial bias, could reflect social factors, but it's a clear pattern in the data.
And what about inbreeding? With such tight-knit groups, was that an issue?
This is remarkable. Despite these extensive family networks and high relatedness within sites, they didn't find a single case of close consanguinity, meaning unions between first cousins or closer.
Not one. That's amazing.
It implies they had a very sophisticated understanding of their own genealogies and actively avoided close inbreeding, even while living in these dense kin-based communities.
That speaks volumes about their social awareness. Anything else on family structures?
They did find evidence of individuals having children with multiple partners. At least 11 cases suggested either polygamy or maybe serial monogamy.
So, not strictly one partner for life in all cases.
Apparently not. But, interestingly, unlike some other contemporary groups, there was no genetic evidence for practices like levirate marriage, where a man marries his deceased brother's widow.
Okay. And did the way they organized the cemeteries change too?
Significantly. While burying close relatives near each other is common across many cultures and times, only during the Slavic period did these East German cemeteries show a really strong, statistically significant correlation between how closely related people were genetically and how close together they were buried physically.
Meaning they were deliberately arranging the cemetery space based on family groups.
It strongly suggests that, yes, these weren't just random burial grounds. They seem to have been actively planned and structured around these large kin groups. The statistical test for this pattern was very strong.
That's incredible detail from Grays.
Yeah.
What about differences between men and women in these societies? You mentioned patriarchality earlier.
Yes, the genetics provided clear evidence for that. While the overall number of buried adult men and women was balanced across the Slavic period sites, women had significantly fewer close relatives buried within the same site compared to men. They also showed more genetic variation within a site.
Meaning they were more likely to be outsiders genetically within that specific village or community?
Sort of, but here's the key. Women shared more genetic segments, what geneticists call identity by descent, or IBD segments, with people buried at other different sites than men did.
So women were the ones moving between communities for marriage.
Exactly. The study concluded that exogenous origin was more common for females than for males, suggesting a patrilocal inheritance organization. Women typically moved to their husband's community. They estimated about 88% of lineages traced through males staying put versus only 12% of female lineages.
A very clear patrilocal system revealed by the DNA. Was this seen elsewhere, like in Croatia, where there was more mixing?
Interestingly, yes. A similar pattern of patrilocality, women moving, men staying, was observed at the Velum site in Croatia, even though the average family units buried together there were smaller than in East Germany.
So a shared fundamental organizing principle about kinship and marriage, even if the community size or degree of mixing varied regionally.
It seems so. It highlights this common social structure underpinning the expansion, adapting as needed to local circumstances.
This is amazing. We've really gone from, as you said, this shadowy historical puzzle, this enigma, to an incredibly detailed picture. It feels like the fog has genuinely lifted, thanks to this genetic research.
It really has. This deep dive, I think, shows us the Slavic expansion wasn't some simple single story. It was dynamic, it was complex, multifaceted, a huge transformation.
And truly, as Krauss said, the last continental-scale event to fundamentally remake Europe's genetic and linguistic map, the echoes are still with us.
Absolutely. Still resonating today.
So for you listening, this isn't just, dusty old history. It's really about understanding the deep, complex roots of the cultures, the languages, the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe today.
And it's also a story about how societies can adapt, innovate, and even thrive during times of massive pressure and change.
Yeah. Which brings us maybe to a final thought. You've highlighted the flexibility, the adaptability, the sort of grassroots nature of these early Slavic communities. They built successful societies without rigid hierarchies, focusing on resilience.
Right. Success through adaptation, not just conquest.
So maybe the question for us today, living in our own era of rapid change and shifting global dynamics, is what lessons could we possibly draw from a historical movement that found its strength not in empire building, but in social resilience and the ability to adapt from the ground up?
That's a powerful question to ponder. What does that model offer us now?